The cruelest invitations are the ones wrapped in gold. Naomi Carter stared at the cream-colored envelope resting beside her coffee mug while rain slid slowly down the apartment window behind her. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Ethan Walker. Even after 2 years, his name still carried the same cold precision, like a polished knife left untouched in a drawer. She opened it carefully, her fingertips steady despite the pressure tightening quietly beneath her ribs. The wedding invitation smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fresh ink. Ethan always cared about details that impressed strangers. The ceremony would take place at the Langford Grand Hotel downtown, a place where chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls and valet attendants opened doors for people who never looked them in the eye. At the bottom of the card, beneath the elegant gold lettering, a handwritten sentence curved across the page. "Hope you can finally move on." Naomi let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Outside, thunder rolled softly above Chicago's skyline while her apartment radiator hissed against the cold October evening. She folded the invitation once and placed it back inside the envelope with slow, careful hands. 3 nights later, black heels clicked against polished marble as she stepped through the towering entrance of the Langford Grand Hotel. Warm light spilled from crystal chandeliers overhead, reflecting against silver trays of champagne carried through the ballroom by servers in white gloves. The room smelled like roses, perfume, and money. Conversations floated beneath the sound of a live jazz quartet near the stage. Naomi paused for half a second when she noticed the stairs. Some recognized her immediately. Others looked twice because she was impossible not to notice tonight. Her satin black dress was simple, elegant, untouched by desperation. No diamonds. No dramatic entrance. Just quiet grace wrapped in composure. A young hostess approached with a tight smile and glanced down at the seating chart. "Naomi Carter?" she asked. Naomi nodded once. The hostess hesitated awkwardly before pointing toward the back corner of the ballroom near the service hallway. "You'll be seated over there." Naomi followed the direction without a word. As she walked through rows of candlelit tables filled with attorneys, investors, and women in shimmering designer gowns, whispers moved faster than the music. "Ethan's ex. She actually came. That's embarrassing." Naomi kept her shoulders straight. The farther she walked, the dimmer the lighting became. Her assigned table sat beside a swinging silver kitchen door where waiters rushed in and out carrying plates of filet mignon and wine glasses. One of the servers nearly bumped into her before stopping abruptly. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quickly. Then his eyes dropped to her table placement, and his expression shifted with embarrassment. "I thought you worked here." For one dangerous second, silence settled between them. Naomi simply smiled. "No," she said softly. "Not tonight." The waiter apologized again and disappeared through the kitchen doors. Naomi pulled out her chair slowly and sat down alone while laughter echoed from the brighter side of the ballroom. Across the room, Ethan stood near the stage in a tailored tuxedo, one hand resting confidently against Vanessa Sinclair's waist while photographers circled them like moths around fire. Vanessa leaned up to whisper something into his ear, and both of them laughed. Ethan glanced toward the back corner casually at first. Then he saw Naomi. His smile sharpened instantly. Not surprised. Not guilty. Satisfied. Like a man checking whether a wound still hurt. Naomi lifted her champagne glass without looking away. Her fingers remained perfectly still against the crystal stem, even while humiliation pressed against the room like invisible smoke. Above the ballroom, on the second-floor balcony overlooking the reception, a man in a black suit quietly lowered his whiskey glass. Alexander Reed had spent the last 10 minutes watching everyone except the bride and groom. And the moment Naomi smiled through humiliation instead of breaking beneath it, she became the only person in the room he could no longer ignore. The farther the night moved forward, the colder the ballroom seemed to become. Naomi sat alone at the edge of the reception while laughter rolled through the brighter side of the room like waves crashing against glass. Every few minutes, another guest glanced toward her table before whispering something behind a champagne flute or a polite smile. Nobody came to sit with her. Nobody needed to explain why. The string quartet shifted into a slower melody while waiters carried plates of steak and roasted potatoes beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Naomi looked down briefly at the untouched glass of champagne in front of her. Tiny bubbles climbed endlessly to the surface before disappearing. For a moment, she wondered if Ethan had planned every detail of this night himself. The seat near the kitchen doors, the distance from the stage, the perfect angle for humiliation. Across the ballroom, Vanessa Sinclair stood beneath soft golden lighting like she had rehearsed every smile since childhood. Her diamond engagement ring flashed each time she lifted her hand dramatically while talking to guests. She was beautiful in the polished way expensive things often were. Sharp cheekbones, white silk gown, controlled laughter. Nothing about her looked accidental. Then Vanessa noticed Naomi again. A slow smile touched the corner of her lips before she turned toward the microphone near the center stage. "Can I steal everyone for a second?" she asked brightly. The room quieted almost instantly. Silverware stilled against porcelain plates. Heads turned toward the bride, while camera flashes flickered softly around her. Vanessa lifted her champagne glass and laughed lightly. "Tonight is obviously about new beginnings," she said. "But I also believe we should appreciate the people who helped shape our journey." A few guests nodded politely. Ethan smirked beside her, already knowing where this was going. Vanessa scanned the ballroom theatrically before her eyes landed on Naomi near the service hallway. "Naomi," she called sweetly. "There you are." Several guests turned fully in their seats now. Naomi looked up slowly but did not move. Vanessa continued smiling. "I just wanted to thank you personally for helping Ethan become the amazing man he is today." A few scattered laughs escaped. Immediately. "Seriously," Vanessa added. "Sometimes the wrong woman prepares a man for the right one." The laughter grew louder this time. Not explosive. Worse. Controlled. Wealthy people laughter. The kind designed to humiliate without appearing cruel. Naomi felt every eye in the room settle onto her skin at once. Ethan lowered his head slightly, pretending embarrassment while enjoying every second of it. One woman near the front table whispered something into her husband's ear before both of them smiled behind their wine glasses. Naomi kept her expression calm, even as heat crawled slowly into her chest. She folded her hands carefully in her lap, so nobody would notice the slight tremble in her fingers. Then Vanessa tilted her head innocently. "You are still single, right?" Another wave of laughter rolled through the ballroom. Naomi heard the kitchen doors swing open behind her. Heard dishes clatter somewhere far away. Heard her own heartbeat pressing steadily against the silence inside her body. But when she finally spoke, her voice remained soft. "Yes," she said. "I am." Vanessa smiled wider, clearly expecting pain, anger, something dramatic enough to entertain the room. Instead, Naomi lifted her champagne glass slightly toward the bride. "And I still know how to leave a table with dignity." The laughter stopped almost instantly. Not because the words were loud, because they were not. Ethan's jaw tightened for half a second before he forced another smile toward the crowd. Vanessa laughed awkwardly and turned back toward the stage, pretending the moment had not landed harder than she expected. But above the ballroom, leaning quietly against the balcony railing with one hand resting near his whiskey glass, Alexander Reed watched Naomi differently now. Not with pity, not with curiosity, with recognition. Because while everyone else in that room had spent the night trying to measure her worth by where she was seated, she had just revealed something none of them possessed at all. Humiliation becomes heavier when the room pretends it is entertainment. Naomi could feel it settling over the ballroom now, like invisible dust. Nobody spoke directly to her after Vanessa returned to the stage, but that almost made it worse. The silence carried judgment inside it. Waiters moved around her table carefully, avoiding eye contact. Somewhere near the dance floor, glasses clinked while guests resumed conversations that sounded just slightly too loud, as if everyone needed reassurance that the uncomfortable moment had already passed. Naomi reached for her champagne again, but before the glass touched her lips, the overhead lights dimmed slowly across the ballroom. A soft murmur spread through the crowd. Ethan stepped onto the center stage beside the live band, while applause rolled toward him from every direction. His tuxedo fit perfectly beneath the warm amber lighting, the picture of polished success. The kind of man magazines described as self-made, while forgetting how many people had quietly bled beside him on the climb upward. Vanessa looked at him with theatrical admiration while photographers gathered near the stage again. Ethan adjusted the microphone with a relaxed smile. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began smoothly. "Honestly, seeing everyone together like this reminds me how strange life can be sometimes. Laughter rippled politely through the room. Naomi already recognized that tone in his voice. The storytelling tone. The version of Ethan that could turn cruelty into charm if enough people were watching. A few years ago, he continued, I honestly thought my life was headed in a completely different direction. Several guests smiled knowingly. Vanessa tilted her head against his shoulder. Ethan glanced casually toward the back of the ballroom. Toward Naomi. I used to believe loyalty was enough to build a future. A few people nodded. Turns out ambition matters too. More laughter followed. Softer this time. Sharper. Naomi kept her eyes fixed on the candle burning at the center of her table. The flame flickered gently against the dark glass vase while Ethan's voice continued drifting through the speakers overhead. Some relationships teach you what you want, he said. Others teach you what you cannot afford to settle for. Vanessa covered her smile with manicured fingers while several guests laughed openly. Now, Naomi felt the words land exactly where he intended them to. Public. Surgical. Clean enough to avoid looking cruel. Dirty enough to leave scars anyway. One woman near the front whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath before grinning into her wine glass. Ethan looked pleased with himself now, completely comfortable under the spotlight. But life works out the way it should, he added. Eventually you stop carrying dead weight and start building the future you actually deserve. The room burst into louder applause. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the untouched champagne beside her. For the first time all night, her fingers tightened hard enough around the stem that the glass gave a tiny cracking sound beneath the pressure. Not enough to shatter, just enough to reveal how much restraint it took to remain still. Then suddenly, through the applause and laughter, another sound cut across the ballroom. A chair moving. Slow. Deliberate. Naomi looked up instinctively. On the second-floor balcony, Alexander Reed had finally stepped away from the railing. One hand rested calmly inside the pocket of his black tailored coat, while the other held a half-finished whiskey glass. He was not smiling. He was watching Ethan with the kind of quiet expression powerful men wear before deciding whether someone deserves to remain in the room. Several guests noticed him immediately. One investor near the dance floor straightened almost instantly. Another man whispered something urgently to his wife. The atmosphere shifted so subtly most people could not explain why they suddenly felt nervous. Ethan, unaware, continued smiling beneath the ballroom lights. Tonight is proof, he said confidently, raising his champagne toward Vanessa, that everything eventually falls into the right hands. But Naomi no longer looked at Ethan. Her eyes followed Alexander as he began descending the grand staircase overlooking the reception floor. And for the first time that entire evening, someone in the room was not looking at her with amusement, pity, or judgment. He was looking at her like he had finally found the only honest person left in a ballroom full of performance. The music continued, but something inside the ballroom had shifted. It moved beneath the surface quietly, like the moment before a storm finally breaks across a lake. Naomi could feel it without understanding why. Guests who had ignored her all evening suddenly glanced toward the grand staircase instead of the stage. Conversations lowered. Smiles tightened. Even the waiters seemed more alert now, adjusting silver trays with nervous precision as Alexander Reed descended one slow step at a time beneath the chandelier light. Ethan noticed the change too. His confidence flickered for only a second before he recovered it with another polished smile for the crowd. "Let us all enjoy tonight," he said into the microphone while lifting his champagne glass. "To new beginnings." Applause followed again, though weaker now. Distracted, Ethan stepped down from the stage beside Vanessa, greeting guests as cameras flashed around them. But several investors near the front had already turned their attention elsewhere, toward the man crossing the ballroom floor in silence. Naomi lowered her eyes, pretending not to notice him approaching. She was suddenly aware of every small thing around her. The soft jazz piano near the dance floor. The cold stem of the champagne glass against her fingertips. The faint scent of roses woven into the centerpiece beside her. Even her own breathing felt too loud inside her chest. Alexander stopped beside her table. Up close, he looked even calmer than he had from the balcony. No performance. No arrogance. Just stillness. The kind built from years of never needing approval from anyone in the room. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. Naomi looked up slowly. His voice was low and even. carrying none of the amusement she had endured all night. Several nearby guests immediately fell silent, pretending not to listen. Naomi glanced at the empty chair across from her. "Apparently not," she replied softly. Alexander pulled the chair back and sat down without hesitation. A few tables away, one woman nearly dropped her fork. Another man whispered urgently, "That is Reed." Naomi noticed the reactions immediately, but chose not to ask questions. Alexander loosened one cuff slightly before resting his gaze on the ballroom instead of directly on her. "You handled that speech better than most people would," he said. Naomi gave a faint smile that barely touched her lips. People usually expect pain to look louder. Alexander studied her quietly for a moment. "And does it?" he asked. Naomi looked toward the dance floor where Ethan and Vanessa posed for photographs beneath warm golden lighting. They looked perfect from far away. Expensive. Untouched. "No," she answered after a pause. "Most of the time it just learns how to sit still." For the first time that evening, Alexander smiled slightly. Not flirtation. Recognition. As if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Across the ballroom, Vanessa finally noticed him sitting beside Naomi. Her expression changed instantly. Confusion first, then concern. She leaned toward Ethan and whispered something quickly into his ear. Ethan glanced toward Naomi's table casually at first. Then his posture stiffened. "What is he doing here?" Vanessa murmured beneath her smile. Ethan did not answer. Near the stage, two older investors straightened their jackets before walking directly toward Alexander's table. One of them extended his hand immediately. "Mr. Reed," he said respectfully, "I did not realize you would be attending tonight." The entire atmosphere around Naomi changed in less than 10 seconds. Waiters who had ignored her table moments earlier suddenly approached, offering fresh champagne and dessert menus. Guests who once stared with amusement now avoided looking directly at her at all. Alexander shook the investor's hand politely before answering, "I was invited late." His eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi. "But I am glad I came." Ethan watched the exchange from across the ballroom, his expression slowly hardening beneath the reception lights. Because for the first time all night, the attention in the room no longer belonged to the bride and groom. It belonged to the woman they had seated beside the service hallway. Power changes the temperature of a room faster than money ever could. 10 minutes earlier, Naomi had been invisible. Now every conversation near her table carried hesitation inside it. Guests who once laughed comfortably suddenly adjusted their posture whenever Alexander Reed glanced in their direction. Even the musicians near the stage seemed quieter, their soft jazz blending into the low tension spreading beneath the ballroom lights. Naomi noticed it all while pretending not to. She had spent too many years surviving rooms exactly like this one not to recognize how quickly people rewrote their behavior around influence. Alexander remained calm beside her, one hand resting loosely against the arm of his chair while investors drifted in and out offering greetings. He acknowledged each of them politely, never standing, never trying to dominate the room. That alone unsettled people even more. Truly powerful men rarely needed to announce themselves. A waiter appeared carrying fresh champagne on a silver tray. Earlier that same waiter had walked past Naomi 3 separate times without stopping. Now he nearly bowed while setting the glass carefully in front of her. "Thank you," Naomi said softly. The waiter nodded nervously and disappeared. Alexander noticed the interaction but said nothing immediately. Across the ballroom, Ethan's smile had begun to look strained beneath the constant photography flashes. He kept shaking hands, laughing too loudly, touching Vanessa's waist every few seconds as though reassurance could be performed into existence. But his eyes kept drifting back toward Naomi's table, toward Alexander, toward the attention leaving him one guest at a time. "You are making him nervous," Naomi said quietly without looking away from the dance floor. Alexander lifted his whiskey glass slightly. "No," he replied. "His own behavior is making him nervous." Naomi looked at him for the first time since he sat down. His expression remained unreadable beneath the warm amber lighting. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough." The answer landed softly between them. Naomi looked down at her hands resting near the champagne glass. The tiny crack in the stem from earlier was still visible beneath the candlelight. Alexander noticed that too. "You almost broke it," he observed. Naomi gave the faintest smile. "It survived. So did you." The words were simple, calm, but they reached somewhere deeper than she expected. For a moment, the ballroom noise faded behind the sudden memory of cold winter mornings 2 years earlier. Riding the Red Line train before sunrise while balancing a paper cup of cheap coffee between numb fingers. Working double shifts at a downtown marketing firm after Ethan left her with unpaid rent and silence. Coming home to an apartment so empty she could hear the refrigerator humming from the bedroom. She remembered standing in grocery store aisles calculating whether blueberries were worth $7 this week. Remembered crying exactly once in the shower before deciding nobody would ever see her beg to be loved again. Naomi blinked slowly and returned to the present. The ballroom lights reflected softly against the marble floor while couples drifted toward the dance area. Most people think survival looks dramatic, she said quietly. It does not. Usually it just looks like showing up to work when your heart is tired. Alexander studied her carefully, and for the first time that evening, something almost personal entered his expression. Not attraction alone. Respect. That is because dignity is expensive, he said, and most people are too weak to pay for it. Naomi let out a small breath that nearly became a laugh. Near the stage, Vanessa suddenly approached their table with controlled elegance and a smile sharpened by discomfort. "Mr. Reed," she said brightly, "I had no idea you knew Naomi." Alexander turned his gaze toward her slowly. The entire table beside them fell silent. "I did not," he answered evenly. "Until tonight." Vanessa's smile flickered almost invisibly. Ethan appeared beside her seconds later, adjusting his tuxedo cuff while forcing confidence back into his posture. "Alexander," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "I wish someone had told me you were attending." Alexander looked at the offered hand for one quiet second before finally shaking it once. Firm, brief, controlled. "Some invitations are more interesting than others," he replied. And standing there beneath the crystal chandeliers, with half the ballroom secretly watching, Ethan finally began to understand that the woman he invited to humiliate was no longer sitting alone. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a space quietly rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. Naomi could sense it even without looking up. Conversations that had once revolved around Ethan and Vanessa now fractured into smaller, uncertain clusters. People were no longer watching the stage with full attention. They were watching the table near the service hallway, watching Alexander Reed, and by extension, watching her. Naomi kept her posture steady, her hands folded lightly near the base of the champagne glass, as if stillness alone could preserve control over a room that had already decided to change direction without asking permission. Alexander remained seated beside her, calm as ever, but the presence he carried had shifted everything. Not because he raised his voice, not because he demanded attention, but because attention had started to leave everyone else on its own. Ethan stood near the edge of the stage now, his earlier confidence thinning under the weight of observation. Vanessa stayed close beside him, but even her smile had started to feel more measured, less certain. She adjusted her grip on his arm slightly, as if trying to anchor him to a moment that was already slipping. "You seem very comfortable here," Alexander said quietly without looking at Naomi directly. Naomi exhaled slowly. "I learned a long time ago that discomfort does not always announce itself loudly," she replied. "Sometimes it just becomes normal." Alexander nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something he already understood about her. Across the ballroom, a sudden movement drew attention. One of the senior investors who had greeted Alexander earlier approached Ethan with polite urgency. Their conversation was brief, controlled, but Ethan's expression changed in a way that was impossible to hide. The smile he had been holding for the crowd began to fade at the edges. Naomi noticed it immediately, but said nothing. She had seen that expression before. It was the moment when a person realized they were no longer controlling the narrative in the room. Vanessa whispered something to Ethan again, her eyes flicking toward Alexander and Naomi with growing tension. "Who exactly is he?" she asked under her breath. Ethan forced a light laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Just someone important in finance," he said quickly. But the way he said it suggested he was already recalculating everything he thought he knew. At the same time, another shift moved through the ballroom. Staff members began circulating more attentively near Alexander's table. A senior hotel manager appeared briefly, bowing his head slightly before retreating without drawing attention. The energy of the room tightened further, like a string pulled too far without snapping. Naomi finally looked toward Alexander again. "This changes the atmosphere," she said quietly. Alexander followed her gaze across the ballroom. "It was already changing before I arrived," he replied. "I am just the point where people notice it." Naomi studied him for a moment. "You are used to rooms like this?" she said. "Rooms like this are used to me," he corrected gently. There was no arrogance in his tone, only observation. Ethan finally stepped down from the stage, moving toward his table with Vanessa following closely. His earlier performance had ended, but his awareness of the room had sharpened. He glanced again at Naomi, then at Alexander, then at the cluster of investors now subtly redirecting their attention. Something in his posture tightened. Not anger. Calculation. The realization that influence in the room had shifted to a place he had not anticipated. Vanessa tried to maintain composure, but her smile had thinned into something fragile. "This is still our night," she whispered to Ethan. But Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched as another guest left his side conversation mid-sentence to approach Alexander's table. Naomi noticed that too. The slow erosion of attention, the quiet redistribution of importance. It was not loud enough for most people to name it, but it was undeniable in its effect. Alexander finally turned slightly toward Naomi, his voice lower now. "Tell me something," he said. Naomi met his gaze. "Do you usually stay in places where you are underestimated?" Naomi paused before answering. "I used to think staying meant strength," she said. "Now I think leaving quietly is stronger." Alexander regarded her for a long moment, as if weighing the truth in her words against everything he had seen that evening. "Then perhaps you have already outgrown this room," he said softly. And for the first time since she arrived, Naomi did not feel like she was sitting at the edge of someone else's story. She felt like the room itself was beginning to shift around her. The tension in the ballroom did not rise suddenly. It tightened slowly, like a breath held for too long, spreading from table to table until even the most confident smiles began to feel rehearsed. Naomi could sense it in the way conversations fractured around her, in the way laughter no longer carried freely across the polished marble floor. People were still talking, still drinking, still performing normalcy, but now every gesture seemed measured against something larger that had entered the room without permission. Alexander Reed remained seated beside her, but the effect of his presence had already moved far beyond their table. Investors who had once stayed near Ethan and Vanessa were now subtly drifting away, not in groups, but individually, as if each decision to step closer to Alexander felt like a private correction of judgment. Ethan noticed it too. He was no longer smiling with ease. His movements were still controlled, but the control had shifted from confidence to calculation. Vanessa leaned in close to him, whispering something urgent, her expression carefully composed for anyone watching from a distance. But the tension in her eyes betrayed her. "This is not how tonight was supposed to feel," she said quietly. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched as another guest left his side of the room mid-conversation to approach Alexander's table. That small movement seemed to settle into him like a weight. Naomi kept her gaze lowered for a moment, then slowly looked up again. She was not surprised by what was happening. She had lived long enough in rooms like this to recognize when attention was no longer being given freely, but redirected by influence. Alexander finally spoke again, his voice calm, almost detached. "You are observing everything," he said. Naomi nodded slightly. "It is hard not to," she replied. "Rooms like this teach you to notice when you stop being part of the center of gravity." Alexander regarded her for a moment, then turned his attention briefly toward the ballroom. "Most people confuse attention with importance," he said. "They are not the same thing." At that exact moment, a senior executive from one of the largest investment firms in attendance stepped away from Ethan's circle and walked directly toward Alexander. The conversation was brief, respectful, and visibly deferential. When the executive left, he did not return to Ethan's side. Instead, he moved toward another cluster of guests near Alexander's table. Ethan saw it clearly now. The erosion was not imagined. It was structural. Vanessa's smile faltered for the first time, just slightly, as she followed Ethan's gaze. "Why is everyone going to him?" she asked under her breath. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, a habitual gesture that no longer seemed to stabilize anything. "Because they think he matters," he said quietly. "Or because they already know something we do not." Naomi heard that from a distance, though she did not turn around. She felt the shift more than she saw it. The ballroom lights still glowed warm and elegant. The music still played softly, and the event still looked unchanged to anyone entering the room for the first time. But inside it, something fundamental had begun to reorganize itself. Alexander finally stood, not dramatically, not for attention, but simply as if the conversation around him required movement. When he did, the nearest guests instinctively paused, their bodies reacting before their thoughts could catch up. He walked a few steps toward the center of the ballroom, and even that small movement caused a subtle ripple of awareness across the room. Ethan turned fully now, watching him directly for the first time without distraction. Naomi followed Alexander with her eyes as well, noticing how he did not look at the crowd, yet the crowd adjusted. To him anyway. He stopped near a quiet space between tables, just enough distance to be seen clearly without needing to raise his voice. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with precision that carried naturally through the room. Tonight was not planned to be anything other than a private evening, he said evenly. But I would like to correct one misunderstanding that seems to be spreading. The room fell into near silence without instruction. Even the music felt as if it had softened itself in response. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly across the ballroom, passing over Ethan, then Vanessa, then settling for a fraction of a second on Naomi before returning to the room as a whole. Respect, he continued calmly, is not determined by where someone is seated. It is determined by how a room responds when they finally stand. No one spoke. No one moved. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, the first clear sign that his control over the evening was no longer intact. Vanessa looked around as if searching for support that no longer felt available. And Naomi, sitting still at the edge of it all, realized that for the first time since she had entered that ballroom, she was no longer being measured by the people who had tried to define her. The room itself had started measuring them instead. The silence that followed Alexander Reed's words did not feel empty. It felt controlled, as if the entire ballroom had been placed under an invisible agreement to listen before reacting. Naomi could sense it in the stillness of the chandeliers above, in the way even the faint clinking of glassware seemed to hesitate before continuing. Ethan stood frozen for a moment longer than he intended, his hand still near his cuff, as if he had forgotten how to move it. Vanessa, beside him, was no longer smiling. Her expression had shifted into something carefully neutral, but the effort it took to maintain it was visible in the tightness of her jaw. Alexander remained where he was, not elevated, not centered, but somehow impossible to ignore. He did not raise his voice again. He did not need to. The room was already listening differently. This evening was never intended to become a demonstration. Alexander said calmly, his tone steady and precise. But circumstances have made certain perceptions unavoidable. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Not a reaction yet, more like recognition forming slowly. Naomi kept her eyes on him. She was no longer trying to interpret what was happening. She was simply observing it unfold. Alexander's gaze moved briefly across the guests, not lingering on anyone long enough to feel confrontational, yet long enough that each person felt individually seen. When people gather in a space like this, he continued, they often assume that visibility is the same as value. A pause followed. It is not. Ethan shifted slightly, the first clear sign of discomfort breaking through his composure. Vanessa glanced toward him, searching for reassurance that did not arrive. Alexander's attention returned to the room as a whole. There is a tendency to believe that position determines worth, he said. That seating arrangement determines significance. That proximity determines relevance. His words were not sharp, but they carried weight because they were calm. None of those assumptions are reliable. Naomi noticed how the room had changed again. People were no longer reacting emotionally. They were recalibrating internally. Investors who had spent the evening aligned with Ethan now stood in subtle stillness, as if reviewing information they had previously accepted without question. Alexander finally turned slightly toward Ethan for the first time during his speech. Mr. Walker, he said evenly, and the use of Ethan's full name without familiarity immediately shifted the tone of the moment. Ethan straightened instinctively. Yes, he responded quickly, attempting to regain control of his voice. Alexander paused just long enough for the silence to become noticeable. You have hosted an impressive evening, he said. But influence is not measured by presentation. A brief glance toward Naomi followed, not dramatic, not performative, but precise. It is measured by recognition. Ethan's expression tightened. Vanessa's hand touched his arm lightly, but the gesture now felt more like grounding than support. Alexander continued, his voice still level. The people in this room are free to draw their own conclusions, he said. However, some conclusions are already being drawn without assistance. A few guests exchanged quiet looks. One investor near the side of the ballroom stepped slightly away from Ethan's cluster without explanation. Naomi noticed it. So did Ethan. The shift was no longer subtle to those paying attention. It was directional. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to regain composure. I am not sure I understand the point of this, he said carefully, attempting to reintroduce authority into his tone. Alexander regarded him calmly. Understanding is not required, he replied. Only awareness. The distinction landed quietly but firmly. Vanessa's gaze moved between the two men, her earlier confidence replaced by calculation. She was no longer certain which version of the evening she was standing inside. Naomi remained seated, but her awareness had sharpened. She was no longer the subject of the room's attention. She had become the reference point through which attention was being redirected. That realization did not feel dramatic. It felt structural. Alexander finally took a small step back, signaling the end of his statement without ceremony. The room did not immediately return to conversation. Instead, it adjusted slowly, like a system processing a new condition. Ethan attempted to speak again, but his voice did not carry the same ease it had earlier in the night. Perhaps we should continue enjoying the evening, he said, forcing lightness into his tone. A few guests nodded out of politeness, but the energy did not recover. Because now, no one was certain which version of the evening they were meant to be enjoying. Naomi looked briefly toward Alexander. He was no longer addressing the room. He had already returned to stillness, as if what had needed to be said had been completed without effort. You did not come here to intervene, Naomi said quietly. Alexander turned his attention to her. No, he replied. I came here because I noticed something that did not match the story being told. Naomi held his gaze for a moment. And what story is that? She asked. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved briefly across the ballroom once more, taking in the subtle fractures that had formed in the social order of the night. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. That people are always where they belong, he said. Some rooms only reveal the truth when someone refuses to accept the version being sold. And in that moment, Naomi understood that the room had not changed because of confrontation. It had changed because someone finally stopped pretending not to see what was already there. The ballroom no longer felt like a place built for celebration. It felt like a place where perception itself had been permanently altered. Naomi could sense it in the way people no longer laughed without restraint, in the way conversations now paused before certain names were spoken, in the way Ethan Walker stood at the edge of his own event, as if trying to understand when the center of gravity had shifted away from him. Vanessa remained beside him, but her presence no longer carried certainty. Her smile had softened into something fragile, maintained more out of habit than confidence. Across the room, Alexander Reed stood in quiet stillness, no longer speaking, no longer needing to. The room had already absorbed everything he had said. Naomi looked at him, then at Ethan, then at the subtle distance that had formed between people who had once believed they controlled the narrative of the night. Ethan finally stepped forward, raising his voice slightly as if volume could restore order. I think there has been enough confusion tonight, he said, attempting a controlled laugh. This is still a celebration. A few guests nodded instinctively, but the response was delayed, uncertain. The energy he once commanded no longer returned to him cleanly. Alexander did not react immediately. He simply observed. Naomi noticed that silence more than anything else. It was not indifference. It was confirmation. Vanessa leaned closer to Ethan. We should reset the tone, she whispered urgently. Ethan nodded quickly, then turned toward the crowd again. Let us continue enjoying the evening, he said, forcing warmth into his tone. Music, dinner, everything is planned. The band resumed softly, but the sound felt disconnected from the room, as if it no longer belonged to the moment. Guests returned to their tables, but their attention remained fractured. Some still glanced toward Alexander. others toward Naomi. None fully returned to Ethan. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly to her hands. The glass of champagne beside her remained untouched, its surface reflecting the chandelier light in fragmented patterns. She realized something quietly in that moment. The room had not rejected Ethan loudly. It had simply stopped reinforcing him. Alexander finally walked back toward Naomi's table without urgency. When he arrived, he remained standing for a moment rather than sitting. "You are very quiet," he said. Naomi looked up. "There is not much left to say," she replied. Alexander nodded once, as if accepting that answer without challenge. Behind them, Ethan watched. Not directly at first, but through reflection, through movement, through the subtle awareness that attention was no longer distributed evenly in the room. Vanessa tried again to recover the evening. She approached a group of guests near the center of the ballroom, laughing slightly louder than necessary, touching familiar shoulders, attempting to rebuild social continuity. But the responses she received were polite rather than engaged. Ethan noticed it too. Slowly, the realization settled in him that influence in this room was no longer anchored to familiarity or history. It had shifted to presence, to recognition, to something he no longer controlled. Naomi finally spoke again, her voice low enough that only Alexander heard. "This is what happens," she said, "when people realize they have been reacting instead of observing." Alexander looked at her for a moment. "Most people never notice the difference," he replied. Naomi gave a faint nod. "Until it is too late to pretend they did." A brief silence followed between them. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just complete. Across the ballroom, Ethan attempted one final adjustment. He stepped closer to the center again, raising his glass. "To everyone here," he said, voice steady but thinner than before. "Thank you for being part of tonight." The response was polite, controlled, but no longer unified. It was at that moment Ethan understood something he had not prepared for. The room had not turned against him. It had simply stopped orbiting him. Vanessa stood beside him, still smiling, but her eyes flicked toward Alexander again. There was no longer certainty in her expression, only recalculation. Naomi remained seated, but she was no longer positioned as she had been at the beginning of the evening. She was no longer at the edge of the room's awareness. She was inside its awareness. And that difference changed everything. Alexander finally spoke once more, not to the room, but to Naomi alone. "Do you see it now?" he asked. Naomi looked at him, then at Ethan, then at the guests who no longer knew where to place their attention. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was never about the room deciding who belongs." A pause. "It is about who stops asking permission to exist in it." Alexander's expression remained calm, but something in it softened slightly. Around them, the ballroom continued its evening, but nothing about it remained unchanged. The structure of attention had already been rewritten, and no one, not even Ethan Walker, could pretend otherwise anymore.